Hmm. We'll wait for 2-3 more minutes to start our program. As I can see, participants are joining. It's 6 o'clock already. I think just 2 minutes more. Okay. So as I can see, our guest, Vikram Raghavan, has already joined us. I also welcome the legal fellow from World Bank, Esper, will be assisting Vikram Raghavan.
Can you hear me now?
You're audible, sir. You're audible, sir.
Oh, okay. Now?
Yes, sir, you're audible. Yes, sir, you're audible.
And you can see me too?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Oh, okay, good.
We can see. We can see.
Okay, give me 1 second then. I was actually trying again to dial in onto another computer because I thought I couldn't be heard. So, and then let me just check to see if I can put the presentation too.
Okay, sir. Okay, please do.
How do I do that? This is a different interface from the one we are used to using on WebEx. How do I share the presentation? Do you know? Oh, here it is. Okay. Esperanza, are you online?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I don't know if I have the latest version. I think I saved it, but let me just add it, check one more time because I.
Okay.
Okay, sharing Explorer. Okay, you can hear me, right? Still, Manvendra?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, because I'm actually using my. Yeah. So there's a disturb. Is there a disturbance? Is there a disturbance now?
No.
I think someone needs to mute. Okay, can you see the presentation?
Not yet.
Screen was visible. Yeah.
No?
Yes. Visible.
Okay, good.
Presentation.
So maybe, yeah, so maybe you can have everybody shut off their mics while we speak. Only because I'm using my.
I'll do that, sir.
Okay, I'm using my Alexa device. That's why. So.
Okay. So So I welcome
Mr.
Raghavan, who, as we all know, is at the World Bank. And we know more as somebody who has genuine interest in constitutional law and international law, and somebody who loves students from India, and that's why he is very sought after.
Sir, may I intervene?
Yes.
Unable to hear anything.
You come again?
Of echo, we are unable to hear anything.
Yeah, there is echo from my side too.
Echo is a problem.
I can hear echo from my side too.
Yes, even right
Well,
now.
let me see if I
right now it's
1 second. Let me see if I mute. Why don't you speak and then we'll test.
sure, sir. It's fine. Okay. So I welcome Vikram Raghavan, who is working with World Bank for close to 2 decades now. And the important thing is that apart from somebody who is a professional, he has a very keen interest in constitutional law and history and international law. And this is just the beginning of the talks of Mr. Raghavan. And to start with, he'll be talking about international financial institutions. But I must tell my students that he is a scholar of constitutional law and history as well. And I have witnessed to his talk on Constituent Assembly debates, and it was very fascinating to hear Mr. Raghavan. And we would hope that very soon we'll have his talk on Constituent Assembly as well. And a few days back, we had opportunity him on Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar and international law. And it was an eye-opener for almost everybody who was witness to that program about the contribution of Dr. Ambedkar in international law, something about which we know very little. So with this, I welcome Mr. Raghavan. I also welcome the legal fellow at World Bank, Mr. Esperanza Rodriguez, who will be assisting Mr. Raghavan in his presentation. So the floor is yours, Vikram Raghavan.
Yes, thank you, Manvendra. Actually, I just want to thank you for inviting me and to all those who have dialed in. I think that was Swati or somebody else. Wait, you said there was an echo. Is there still an echo? Okay, good. Also, I just wanted to correct one small thing that it's actually my colleague. Well, I guess gender these days are are important, but we are not trying to stereotype. But she is Ms. Esperanza Lopez Rodriguez, not Mr. And maybe you can say hello as well.
My apologies, sir.
You can turn on your screen, Esperanza. No, that's okay.
We are not familiar with the name.
That's okay. That's okay. No, don't worry. Esperanza, do you want to turn on your video? Maybe that's the reason why.
Yeah, hi everybody. I've been trying to, but I think that due to connection problems, the camera is not working. So I'll keep trying, but I don't want to delay the start of the presentation.
Okay, good. That's fine. Now, I just wanted to ask one other thing, Manvendra. Again, thank you for your introduction. And I know that I visited you in Lucknow when you were at the RM Ram Manohar Lohia NLU. So I'm glad to be following you to Jabalpur also, which I hope I will actually come to meet and visit in person. Among the people who are on are most of them your students? Because I know we also put it out. You just get me a sense of who are the participants.
Yes, all are our students. Only those who will be watching YouTube live.
Okay, good. And so these are third or fourth year students, perhaps?
Sir, second year, third year, LLM and PhD.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I'm honored. Well, thanks again. Now, I just wanted to manage expectations about this presentation, which I will do jointly with my colleague Esperanza Lopez Lopez Rodriguez, who you just heard. The presentation is a very basic introduction to international financial institutions, and I'm sort of focusing on the World Bank. If you can't hear me, just maybe say something. Is there a chat function that we can use? Because I don't see that either. Maybe, is there a chat function? Typically, there is a chat function. Let's see. Okay, here there is a chat function. Okay, well, I can see a chat function. So if anyone has any questions, I'm going to keep the chat box open. So if there's any messages that you can't hear, please let me know, or if I'm going too fast. But otherwise, we'll begin, which is to begin with at the beginning, which is this big building, which is which was when it was its most famous point, which was in the late 1950s, the largest wooden structure of its kind in the Northeast United States. This is the Mount Washington Hotel at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, which is in the winters a ski resort, and in the summers you can go there for, like, you'd go to an Indian hill station, I suppose, for some respite from the plains, but also to play golf and to just get away, right? But it is at this location that the international conference, which actually was called the United Nations Monetary Conference, took place in July 1944, at which the World Bank, the institution we now know as the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund were created. Now, at the Bretton Woods Conference, whose 75th anniversary we celebrated last year, there were 44 nations that were present. Why 44? Well, because this is 1944. The war is still raging across Europe. There is a bit of a blip. Is that me causing it or somebody else? It's not bothering me. I just didn't want to I wanted to make sure it's not someone saying something. Do you hear this blip, Manvendra? No? Okay, good. Let me just continue. So, like I said, in 1944, the 44 delegations assembled at the Bretton Woods, this hotel in New Hampshire at the Mount Washington Hotel, where their task was to really create an international financial architecture that would help restore and get the world to recover from the ravages of the war. And so this conference, which took place in July 1944, took place even while the war was still going on in Europe. In fact, the two leading lights at the conference, Harry Dexter White, who was the shorter person here on my left, and then John Maynard Keynes on my right. John Maynard Keynes, we all know, the great British economist. He headed the British delegation to the conference. His counterpart was Harry Dexter White, who worked in the U.S. Treasury Department. Now, the two of these men were, in a way, the chief protagonists at the conference, but also the big rivals. We don't have time to get into all of the detail about the conference, but one thing was interesting is that the conference took place at a time when there was a growing concern about ideological differences. So here you actually have a rare picture of the joint USSR delegation at the conference. The USSR delegation would eventually come to the conference, but not actually sign the eventual outcome, which was the Articles of Agreement. But you also had the Indian delegation present. Now, how India? This interesting question. Remember, I told you, let's go back and look at the date again. It's July 1944. The conference took place between, I think, the 1st of July and the 22nd of July 1944. And yet you had a full-fledged in the sense that they had their own seat at the table, Indian delegation. Now, obviously, one reason for that, you can see the chap in the center of this. This is a photograph of them preparing for the conference while in New Hampshire. And the person in the middle is obviously the head of the delegation, was a Britishman. He was Sir Jeremy Rainsman, who was the finance secretary of India, British India. But you see the people next to him are all Indians. There was a member, there was Mr. Shroff from the Tata Company. There were was a future finance minister of India, who's sitting next to Jeremy Rainsman, and quite a few other people who were not necessarily, let's say, British babus, right? So this is a very interesting picture of a delegation that was invited to the conference that was not yet an independent country, but it was soon to be independent. But remember, the Congress party leaders were all still locked up. So it's not like, the move to Indian independence had begun. I mean, they knew it was on the horizon, but India was still represented at this conference. Now, there were also other countries too. Many of these countries were actually still under occupation by Nazi Germany, but they also sent delegates to this conference through representatives in exile. So the eventual outcome of the conference was the adoption of these two documents, the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction of Development's Articles of Agreement. These are the two separate documents that the conference drafted and adopted in two separate committees, but obviously they were brought together to the floor. And the conference is concluded with the finalization of, in a way, two separate constitutions for these two institutions. Now, I said when we began that the two institutions that were created at this event were the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. But if you look at the slide, it says the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And that is because there is no such thing, legally speaking, at least in the strict legal sense, of the World Bank. The original World Bank that was created at the Bretton Woods Conference together with the International Monetary Fund was called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD. Now, that kind of got a nickname as the Bank because it's supposed to be a bank for all member countries of the world, therefore World Bank. But legally speaking, the name remains International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Over the years, IBRD has acquired a number of affiliates that together with IBRD, which, like I said, is sometimes called the World Bank, but IBRD plus the other affiliates together are called the World Bank Group. So at the Bretton Woods Conference, you had the IMF created, and you had the first entity that is now what is now called the World Bank Group, which was IBRD, or the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which itself is sometimes known as the World Bank, just World Bank, one word, usually to mean IBRD. And then when the word World Bank Group is used, it usually means IBRD plus its four affiliates. This is a little confusing, but since we are lawyers, I think it's a nuance I wanted to put on the table. Now, the World Bank opens for business, IBRD opens for business around 1946. Its first loan is made to France. Why? Because 46 is when the war ends, and there's vast devastation across Europe, right? The cities are in ruins and in debris. And so very quickly, IBRD, which the name of the bank suggests is an International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, its first order of business is to help with reconstruction. And so it makes a big loan to France, $250 million, almost $1 billion by today's standards or more, for the reconstruction of France, okay? And this loan, of course, paves the way for other loans in Europe. And so the early years of IBRD were spent in helping European countries recover and reconstruct from the war. And so, for instance, the French loan that I spoke about, among other things, it financed the reconstruction of this port, which is quite damaged, the Marseille port, which was important to restore France's transport infrastructure. It financed railroads in France. It financed the acquisition of Air France's first post-war fleet of planes. Lots of different things were done, right? But then what happened is a few years later, the World Bank got a new president, the second president, and he realized that this reconstruction business was drying up. There are a lot of reasons to explain it. I won't go into it. But he decided that, okay, after 5 or 6 years, fine with the reconstruction business, let's move on to the development side, right? I said it's the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. That's the title. So the bank, this entity began by working on reconstruction. It then, after 4 years, decided we've done enough reconstruction, or we've done as much as we can. Now let's move on to the development side. So that was a declaration by McCoy, who announced this to a surprised audience of bankers in 1948 in New York. And the World Bank started visiting the rest of the world to look for safe and secure development projects. So here's an interesting photograph of the first World Bank team visiting Ethiopia. Ethiopia and the bank. Ethiopia is the first African borrower. India was the first Asian borrower. And so around the late 40s and 50s, the World Bank decided no more reconstruction projects. Let's look for development projects. Now, the meaning of the word development itself was a new one. No one really knew what it meant. In India, of course, it meant 5-year plans. It meant the Mahalanobis Nehru vision of capturing the commanding heights of the economy you would have learned in economics classes. And so the World Bank, too, in a way, was caught up with that idea of development, right? Mostly state-led development. And so it looked around the world for big projects which it could finance. And so it financed large dams in Africa, transport projects in Asia. Here's the 1949 railway loan I just mentioned, the first loan to India. Incidentally, it is the first loan that was signed by a woman, Vijayalakshmi Pandit. And so the bank also financed factories in Latin America, lots of things. And so now, through the 50s, the World Bank, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which began in its early years doing reconstruction loans, had now transitioned into a development bank, right? But development understood in the meaning of the 1950s, which meant large, big mega projects, right? And so the bank also did other things. For instance, it brokered the India-Pakistan Indus water treaty. This is one that has become a little controversial, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But this took place also during the early years of the bank in Karachi. You see here the Pandit Nehru, Prime Minister of India, Ayub Khan, the President of Pakistan, and then you see the man next to him is the President of the World Bank. So this is one of the development for peace initiatives that the World Bank undertook. Now we move on, which is in the 60s, the World Bank decided that the word development had to evolve, right? Just like constitutions evolve, life evolves, law evolves. And the meaning of the word development in the 60s no longer meant just massive big projects in terms of big dams or factories or like large transport infrastructure in terms of railway lines and networks, but it also included more the so-called softer or the more social aspects of development. And so World Bank started giving loans or started financing projects that focused on the human development aspects. So you found, here's the first loan for an education project given to Tunisia, health projects, right? So the meaning of development starts changing in the 60s, the second or the third decade in which the World Bank is in existence. And the World Bank is forced to change along with it because the needs of the countries as they perceive them, the development needs of countries change, and so the World Bank has to match that, right? Now, I'm trying to sort of synchronize a very quick history into one to explain to you how the institution of today works because it's evolved from this past, which began at the Bretton Woods Conference, right? Now, we come to the 70s, right? The world is changing. The meaning of development is changing. It's no longer the early meaning of development that the World Bank encountered. And in 1973, it came a full circle when the World Bank's president at that time, Robert McNamara, he goes to Nairobi, where the annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF were taking place. And he declares that the new focus of the World Bank will be on the elimination of poverty. Now, if you read the Articles of Agreement that I showed you that were adopted at the Bretton Woods Conference in all of their solemnity, the word poverty or poor does not show up. The closest approximation you get to any idea that that the World Bank's mission of development has anything to do with poor people is the idea that there is a provision which says we will focus on less developed countries. But the idea of poverty and poor is not in the Articles of Agreement. Yet, in 25 years, less than 25 years after the World Bank is created, the notion that development, which first meant big dams, then started, was accepted to be social projects. Just before the Nairobi meeting, also meant environmental projects because the first pollution control and environmental projects also came on board in 1971. And by 1973, the focus was to look at development holistically through the idea that poverty is the enemy, right? So the 1973 speech of Robert McNamara in a way transforms the internal mandate and understanding of the bank of what its development role is legally, as well as in a policy sense. What should it be focused on? And the focus is that development has to mean reduction of poverty. So this is the big change, okay? And Mr. McNamara, the president of the World Bank, who comes from a very capitalist background, he was the chairman of the Ford Motor Company. He was the defense secretary under President Johnson. He is basically convinced to adopt this approach by this man, who is a great friend of Amartya Sen, a Pakistani gentleman called Mehboob ul Haq, who went on to create the UNDP's Human Development Index. The idea that development is not measured only by big outputs, but also by the growth and human potential, right? So this happens all in the 70s. Now, here, this is an example, for instance, around the same time, environment is becoming an issue, right? As poverty is redefined to mean the new mandate of the bank, it also means tackling development in its different challenges, right? Including to the environment. So you have the first pollution control or environmental projects. And then in the 1980s, and actually in 1980, the World Bank decided that in addition to lending for projects, whether they be for schools or for anti-pollution control, or again, for large dams or whatever else you wanted to do, population control, nutrition, all of those were interesting themes around that time. The World Bank would also, somewhat controversially, start lending for two countries, not for projects, but to support, basically writing a check to governments to support their programs of development, which are basically government policy reforms, institutional and policy reforms, right? This is what we call the era of structural adjustment. If you were in a law school 20 years ago, like I was, this was a very, very controversial thing, that the World Bank and the IMF were going around the world telling countries what policies to change, not for any particular project, but because they wanted to give a structural adjustment loan. What does structural adjustment loan mean? It means that the loan is used to help countries adjust what their economies to ensure that their modes of production are best suited to their comparative advantage. You may have studied in economics the comparative advantage theory, right? That a country that is good at producing cheese must only produce cheese, right? And should not be producing all kinds of other things. Very controversial, right? This import substitution theory. But this idea of adjustment really comes into being in the late 70s, and in 1980, the World Bank says, in addition to financing, sort of, let's say, tangible development projects of a variety of kinds, we will also start financing policy reform, where there is no project you can see, but the project is really a program of governmental reforms, right? Like the one we took in 91 when liberalization first began. So that was something that began in 1980. Okay, so that is very quickly the history of the World Bank and how it's evolved. I've cut a lot short. I usually add a lot more details to it. But in a nutshell, to show you how an institution that was conceived in the middle of the war began working on reconstruction of the war, then sort of evolved as the world started changing around it and the needs of its members changing to sort of, in a way, change the meaning of development and its role and its mandate. Now, if there are no more questions, and if there are no questions on this part, again, feel free to add in the chat if you have questions, so then I will know you want to speak. We'll go to the next part of the presentation, but let's look at back to basics. What are the legal differences between the IMF and the World Bank? Right. So I told you these are the two institutions that were created at the Bretton Woods Conference, and they have some differences, even though they already obviously come from the same beginning. Now, the World Bank is not a regulatory body. It is not like SEBI. It's not an international regulatory institution. The IMF, on the other, what it does is its main mandate is to assist developing and transition countries. When I say that, it generally does not give a loan to the US. Its last loan to Japan was in the 50s. It has never really lent to the UK. There was a proposal, but it never happened. Right? The World Bank's focus in terms of who will get loans, we'll come to this further, are developing and transition countries, right? And it can help countries that are graduates. Now, what does the meaning of a graduate? Graduate is the pompous term that the World Bank uses for countries that have graduated. They have become developed, so they no longer need World Bank assistance. They are no longer developing countries. They have graduated into, I suppose, developed status, or status that basically does not require them to get more World Bank assistance. So it is possible, because every member country of the World Bank technically can borrow. But as a policy and as a strategic matter, the World Bank's focus is overwhelmingly on countries that are developing and transition, which are measured through a certain per capita income threshold. Okay. Now, the IMF, though, has a different role. It is charged by its articles of agreement that were adopted at the Bretton Woods Conference. So by its member states themselves, under international law, have created an institution that is vested with the powers of macroeconomic surveillance. It's like a Reserve Bank of India. It has certain regulatory and supervisory functions under its statute, which the World Bank, for instance, does not have. We are more like a bank. We make loans and loans for projects and programs. They actually, even if you don't borrow from the IMF or not, you are submitting, by being a member of the IMF, you are submitting to macro surveillance, because the IMF, in a way, has this sort of, supervisory role that no other institution has in a transnational sense. Now, the IMF, of course, works on a complicated process. So how does the IMF function, economically? I won't bore you, and I'm not an IMF lawyer, so I don't want to misrepresent it. But basically, at the core of the IMF's functioning are what are called so-called special drawing rights. Special drawing rights are really an imaginary currency, to put it simply, that were created in the 1970s that basically are a approximation of 5 currencies. So you take 5 currencies: the US dollar, the British pound, the euro. I think that now the Chinese yuan is in it, I forget. So you take the 5 top currencies of the world and then you approximate them. And that is called a special drawing right. So the IMF basically runs a lot of its operations with reference to the concept of special drawing rights. So it does not operate in accordance with one currency, right? So that it avoids fluctuations and, in a way, allegations of favoritism. So the IMF is an institution that operates on the basis of special drawing rights, which at the World Bank is not that important. There is one particular place we use them, but not as much as the IMF. And the IMF lends to both developing and developed countries for balance of payment support. So you find a few years ago, Greece, which is a country the World Bank has not lent to for the last 30 years, from my recollection. 30 years ago, the World Bank decided that Greece was so developed that it no longer required the World Bank assistance and became a graduate, right? It graduated from World Bank lending. But 4 years ago, Greece, under a major economic crisis, went to the IMF, and IMF gave them, I think, $30 billion, massive loan, huge loan, right? So the IMF gave Iceland a big loan. We would never give Iceland a loan unless there was a major issue about them either falling or basically they coming to us in a very extraordinary situation. But Iceland freely went to the IMF and borrowed, because IMF does not have this distinction between developed and developing countries as much as we do in terms of who we give the priority for lending, right? And the reasons for that are very different, are many. Now, let's move on, which is that the World Bank, to sustain itself, to make loans for all these projects, right? Would make, I think, what's the amount Esperanza per year, do you know, of loans we make? About 16 million or 17 million, I think. We can check. Esperanza will check and cover it in her presentation. But basically, the World Bank borrows money to make these loans from the capital markets. So it actually floats bonds to basically get the money that it then uses to lend to countries. The IMF does not do that. It instead relies largely on the paid-in quotas that are basically subscription payments by the countries that are then pooled into what are called the general fund resources. So those are a lot of money. The fund has a big balance sheet, but it primarily comes from member countries' submissions. So it's kind of a reserve. Everyone puts money into it, and then a country that needs it then borrows, right? So I lend it to you on a rainy day, you pay it back to me. The World Bank is more transactional. It goes to the capital markets, borrows, then it lends to a country that needs it, let's say for climate change, and then that country repays the bank, and then with the funds that the sort of the excess of the spread, the bank repays the bondholders, the people from whom it borrowed the money in the first place. The IMF does not work like that. And then we can talk about the maturities later. But let's now come back to the World Bank. We've discussed where the World Bank came from, what its differences are with the World Bank and the IMF. And we'll now come to what's the meaning of the development mandate of the bank. But before that, I see Vishrut Verma has asked, can you please briefly explain, tell if there are any reconstruction projects on the colonies of the European and American? I don't know if America had any colonies. I think it did, perhaps. But no, I'm not sure I understand this question, Vishrut. Maybe you can clarify. But there are no reconstruction projects, to the best of my knowledge, in colonies. Maybe the Indonesia loan of 1950 was I don't know. I have not heard of a colony loan. Now, I should say that when the World Bank was created, obviously there were lots of colonies. India itself was a colony for the first 2 or 3 years of the World Bank's existence. But as you saw, the first loan to India in 1949 came after India became an independent, so it was no longer a colony. But there are cases, especially in the 50s, where the World Bank did lend to colonies. And the Charter of the World Bank, the Articles of Agreement, do envisage the possibility that a colonial power can borrow on behalf of a colonies. But this is such a specialized area, it's a little beyond the scope of this talk. And maybe if you clarify what you actually had in mind, I can give you more details. But while we wait for that, let's move on to this issue of, I mentioned earlier that the World Bank's development, the Bretton Woods Conference creates the World Bank as the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. The meaning of the word development has changed from year to year, culminating in the 1973 speech, where the new meaning of development is the focus on poverty reduction. But this meaning of development is an issue that's not gone away and continues to evolve. And our latest view of what is development is something that is it relates to or raises the question of what is properly then the World Bank's development mandate, right? What does it mean by saying the bank advances development? This I'm going to ask Esperanza to talk about.
I hope that you can now see me and hear me.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. And to answer Vikram's question about the loans that the bank currently has, as of June 2020, the IBRD had $202 billion in loans, and IDA had about 161 billion. So, as you can see,
let me just jump in. Thank you, Esperanza. Sorry, I had not mentioned what IDA is. What IDA is, as Esperanza just said, is the International Development Association. That is I told you, the World Bank is really an institution that comprises of the original entity, IBRD, that was created in 1944, and that later it became the World Bank Group with the addition of other affiliates. I did not go into what those affiliates are, but one of those affiliates is the International Development Association. It really is a bank, but it's called an association because it is meant to symbolize that it's a bank for concessional or for the countries that least can afford borrowing, right? And so IDA, as she calls it, or the International Development Association, is in a way a clone. The way to think about it is an exact clone of IBRD with some differences because it has its own articles of agreement and it lends at a much less rate than IBRD. So it also, there are some differences in how it functions. But when I say it's a clone in the sense that it has the same policies, the same governing structures as IBRD, but in 1960, the World Bank Group created a second IBRD, which they called IDA, which was to cater to the needs of the least developed countries. So that's what she just meant. Sorry, go ahead, Esperanza.
So the World Bank Group's mission is to achieve two goals, which you can see represented here on the slide. The first one would be to end extreme poverty, and this would be done by reducing the share of the global population living in extreme poverty conditions to 3% by 2030, and to promote shared prosperity by increasing the incomes of the poorest 40% in the developing countries. So if we turn to the next slide, we can see that these two goals that the World Bank Group has are fully consistent with the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure many of you have already heard about. So before the Sustainable Development Goals, we had the Millennium Development Goals, which among other issues aimed to cut in half the poverty rate that we had in 1990 by 2015. This goal was met, and the 36% poverty rate that we had in 1990 was declined to 10% in 2015. However, this still left millions behind. And 5 years ago, in 2015, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. These goals are broader and go further than the Millennium Development Goals. And one of the reasons is that whereas the Millennium Development Goals applied only to action in developing countries, the Sustainable Development Goals apply universally to all countries. And among these goals, again, we have the goal to eradicate poverty, which of course is consistent with the bank's goals. The SDGs are not legally binding, but it's expected that countries are going to take ownership and implement them by 2030. So now a question could arise, and we could ask ourselves, how do these goals apply to international organizations like the World Bank Group? Well, in the World Bank's case, this is due to a treaty-based relationship that the bank has as of its foundation with the United Nations. So they cooperate to meet the development goals of the member states. And at the same time, you must also know that the Sustainable Development Goals were developed with a strong participation of the World Bank. So the World Bank currently works on 3 areas to achieve these goals. The first one would be to promote sustainable and inclusive economic growth by creating jobs, by boosting private investment in infrastructure. Second, it invests in human capital, so it creates or tries to create equal opportunities in training, education, health. And finally, it fosters resilience to global shocks and threats, for example, by investing in disaster risk preparedness. And we've seen that this is really important in crises like the COVID-19 pandemic. So with this brief introduction about the mandate, Bikram will now go and explain about the World Bank Group's organization.
Okay, thank you, Esperanza. That was very good. Any questions on this issue? Because this is actually an important part of the presentation on this, on what is the relationship between the Sustainable Development Goals and the World Bank's mandate. Okay, good. I will probably continue the presentation then. Let's look at now how the World Bank is organized, because Professor Manvendra asked me to talk about international financial institutions. So what are the institutional aspects of the World Bank's existence, right? Now, really, the World Bank is 5 different groups, right? And so you have the first one, which is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which I mentioned earlier, is the original bank that was created at the Bretton Woods Conference that basically provides loans to governments that are mostly middle income in nature because they can afford this model where IBRD raises bonds on the capital markets of the world. So it borrows at a certain amount of interest rate, and then it lends that amount of money that it's borrowed to countries for projects and programs. So the country is, the World Bank is not giving that money on a discount. It's giving them at a market rate plus a small spread to cover its own expenses. And so when the countries repay the World Bank, they're repaying at a market rate, right? Which can be low or high depending on what the market's like. But obviously, it also means that countries that are creditworthy can only borrow, right? Who can afford it, and then obviously to whom we can lend on a creditworthy basis. Now, that means that the number of potential borrowers among the large number of countries that are developing countries is limited. And they are largely those that are borrowing from the original World Bank entity, which was IBRD. And it raises its funds by issuing bonds, as this first column says. Then we go to IDA, the International Development Association. I had explained in my comment as Esperanza was speaking what IDA's mandate is. But basically, IDA, or International Development Association, the word association is misleading. It should have been a bank, but they didn't want to call it a bank because they wanted to say we are creating an institution that operates like a bank, but is really an association of countries for development, right? That's why they call it International Development Association. Or it is not an association like an NGO. It is built like a bank. It's just not. It is to give the impression that we are focused on lower income countries. So this IDA's mandate, like I said, IDA is very much a clone of IBRD in terms of the institutional policies, the managing structure. All of us, for instance, work for both institutions interchangeably. Okay, but the operating model is different in that IDA basically gives loans and grants to governments of low-income countries, but the funds for this do not come from the stock market. Well, they do now, a little bit. It's just very new. But primarily the funds for IDA operations to low-income countries comes from donors who give the money to IDA to relend. Like I said, very recently, IDA has also moving to the IBRD model of going to the capital markets to borrow money. But primarily, it has always operated as an institution that has raised money through what are called replenishments or contributions from the developed, or let's call them rich countries of the world, to help lend or finance projects to countries that are low income. So that's the two parts, right? Then we have the third, which is IFC, the International Finance Corporation, basically the third entity within, I said this is the World Bank Group, right? Now, IFC has a different model from the first two. Instead of lending to countries, which typically means to the governments of those countries, so both IBRD and IDA, the borrower of an IBRD or an IDA loan is usually speaking, either the government or a sub-sovereign entity that is within the government. So it's very much a governmental sort of lending, right? Lending transaction. IFC is different. What IFC does, it promotes development, which is in a way a shared sort of, let's say, goal across the whole World Bank Group, but it promotes development by financing private sector enterprises in developing countries. So that's IFC, right? It goes and takes off. I think IFC had stock in, was an early investor in Apollo hospitals, just giving an example. I don't know if that's exactly true. I think it's pretty, my memory is correct. They go in to finance private sector companies within developing countries. So they help in the private sector development. Then you have MIGA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. What its role is to promote foreign direct investment in developing countries by offering to the investors the protection that if something goes wrong, right, if the government basically takes away their money or interferes in their operations, they will get an insurance against something going wrong. So it kind of is a guarantee that you can invest without too much risk in a developing country. And then the fifth entity is one where there are lots of lawyers involved because it's a dispute resolution body. So this is like an arbitration center. Its basic, as the name suggests, it's for settlement of investment disputes. Its basic goal, ICSID, is to settle disputes that take place through various means, primarily through free trade agreements. So agreements, and of course the WTO cases don't come here, but the free trade agreements, bilateral free trade agreements, a lot of them go to ICSID for resolution. Okay, so that's the 5 World Bank group. Now let's come to IBRD, back to IBRD, and look at, in a way, let me just move some of these things out of the way because my screen is now full of boxes. Let's move to what is the relation of member countries to the World Bank group. Member countries are the shareholders, right? So they are at the very top because this is very much an institution owned by shareholders. These shareholders elect governors, okay? And these governors then elect executive directors who basically are the representatives of shareholders on the board. So this is the board of the World Bank, right? It's organized very much in a corporate style, right? This is not like the UN. And then the shareholder representatives who are the, what do you call, board directors, they elect the president, who is typically chosen to be the chief, of the staff of the bank, and the president appoints all of the management and the staff. So this is how the separation of powers works at an international financial institution like the World Bank. Now we move on, which is to this. So this shows you the leadership. So here is the president of the World Bank, David Malpass. This is my boss, who is this lady here in the African lady with there are 2 of them, but the one with the white and pink dress, that's my immediate boss. She is the Senior Vice President Group General Counsel. You should look up her video. She's quite an amazing speaker and a star, actually. So this is the senior management, and behind them you can see the board, the members of the board of directors. Now, the lady in pink here, the white lady in pink, Kristalina Georgieva, she used to be the managing director of the World Bank. She has now become the head of the IMF. So this picture is a little out of date, but it just shows you she has now moved to the other side, and she now is David Malpass's counterpart as the head of the IMF. Now let's move on to the shareholders. Shareholders are only member countries. IBRD 189, IDA is 173. Voting is proportionate to the number of shares you have. That's very complicated, so I won't get into it. But in order to be a member of either IBRD or IDA, you must be a member of the IMF. That's an absolute requirement under the Articles of Agreement. You cannot become a member of the World Bank without first becoming a member of the IMF. And what your shareholding is and what proportion in which it's assigned depends on your global economic position. This is not an institution of one person, one vote. So here's the voting rights. Sorry, here are the number of shares the major shareholders hold and the percentage of shares they allocated, which therefore determines the voting rights they have at the board. Okay. Now, how does the World Bank get funding? Now, primarily, as I mentioned earlier, we go to the capital markets. So there is an equity structure, right? You go out there and you get, there is a market borrowing structure. You borrow from the capital markets, right? You then have equity, which is basically what you have in your balance sheet in terms of paid in capital. You then have loans. You have investments because the money you borrow cannot be directly lent, but you need to keep it somewhere. So IBRD has a very strong asset management team which invests its money. And then you have income. Besides all that, IBRD also gets money from lots of different entities to keep as trust funds because they know that our World Bank manages money well. So lots of countries give money to the World Bank, almost like an investment fund, but we don't give them any great returns. But this is money generally for good development purposes. The World Bank is given to manage as a trust fund. Trust fund means basically like your own money, like trusts in India, like you have a trust. That's very similar. It's the same concept. So this is in a way the overview of the IBRD funding. We don't have time to get into it, but just to give you just to show you, this is very much run like a corporate institution. This is not like an international organization that like the UN, which is not organized in this manner, right? Now, finally, what are the types of World Bank assistance? We can give 3 types of assistance. One are investment projects, which are the sort of same old things we did in the 50s, 60s, roads, bridges, schools. They're called investments because your World Bank is financing investments of specific projects. Then you have something called programs for results, where we are not financing the investments, we are financing the results. I'll come to that in a minute. And the third is policy-based loans, what I talked about, which began in 1980, where we are not financing a project or a school, but we are financing the reform of a program or a policy, right? So if you look at this example, investment financing for improved waste management in Guayaquil, Ecuador, here the investment are these sort of wastewater management plants. That is the investment here, right? But if you look at this Tanzania project, the investment here was the schools and the books, right? But the World Bank is not paying for that. Here, the World Bank is paying physically for the pipes, for the building, right? For the labor to build this plant, right? We are paying against receipts. Okay, here they send us a receipt. Here is the cost of the 400 pipes. So we pay input by input for what it costs to build this plant. In a P4R model, program for results model, we are not actually paying for the classroom or for the teachers or for those books. We are paying kind of a lump sum, saying we see in this class that this country has achieved 90 to 100% literacy. So therefore, we will pay what we think it would have cost the country to achieve this outcome. We are financing the results, not the inputs, right? So we're basically looking at how much, what have they, otherwise we'll have an empty class built and nobody will use it, right? So we feel our money is better served by saying we will finance the results. And then thirdly is policy-based loans, as I said. So for instance, COVID, we now have a big policy-based loan to India. This is the loan agreement that was just signed. It should be on the internet. But here, look at these are all of the actions that the government of India has agreed to do for the COVID operation to the bank. Strengthen the social protection scheme, protecting workers in essential service supply chains. All of this will be found on the internet. Now, who can get a loan? IBRD and IBRD IDA member countries, I mentioned that earlier. Political subdivisions in some countries where the constitutions allow, states can borrow. In India, that's not the case. In Mexico, you can have a state borrowing, but the central government has to guarantee it. A business, industrial, or agriculture enterprise, for instance, SIDBI, NHAI, National Housing Bank of India, National Highways Authority of India, Small Industries Bank of India, they have all been World Bank borrowers, but in all of those cases, the government of India has guaranteed those loans. Now, finally, I just wanted to end with one project I did. It's a few years ago, but since I did it, this is the Tamilnadu Urban Development Project. Lots of information on the internet about it. But among other things, it financed the creation of this tertiary treatment and reverse osmosis plant in Coimbatore, that's the big market in Chennai. And so this is an interesting project, urban project, but focusing very much on urban wastewater management, pollution, right? And so the focus here has really been on helping Tamil Nadu cope, some districts, I think Chennai among others, with growth and expansion, but in a sustainable way. And this project was conceived in accordance with a very elaborate scheme, of course, called the project cycle. So if you begin on the clock, right-hand side and clockwise, it was first identified through a concept note, where there was a vision. Then there was a technical assessment, an economic feasibility assessment, procurement, social management risks. Then we went through a detailed appraisal. Is it worth doing this project, right? There was a consultation with stakeholders. Then there were negotiations for the terms, which I got involved in, right? This part I got involved in stage 4. Then implementation support in terms of actually carrying on the project, right? So the project starts, which is implementation, which can last from anywhere from 5 to 6, 7 years, right? And then completing the project, which I don't think is finished, but which then is capped by the production of what's called the implementation completion report, which says what all did we achieve, what did we do, what did we not do, what are the lessons learned. So this is called the project cycle through which every World Bank project goes through. Here's a photograph of me. I'm not in the photo, but I'm on the other side of the negotiations where I negotiated the legal agreement for this project. And this is how we did it in terms of our dates. More sources are here. Every possible question you have, the answer probably is on our website, which is lots of information. And we also have a lot of blogs. And then, of course, many, many, many publications. Thank you very much, Manvindra, for giving Esperanza and me this opportunity.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I would want students, those who have participated, if you have any questions, you can even ask related questions, related in the sense the ones which Vikram has not specifically talked about, but relates to international financial institutions. First thing which every student gets interested into, Vikram, is how to be a Vikram Raghavan. So I must tell my students that you need to be a little patient, and that don't start jumping the gun, and you need to start from big. So right now you should all focus upon what he has spoken about, rather than becoming somebody who wants to work with the World Bank, and all these things fascinate you. But I must tell you that you need to put a lot of hard work to actually even think of doing an internship with the World Bank. So it takes quite a lot for you to actually be there. So as of, I would want you to focus on what he has spoken about, and to know more about the working of international financial institutions. You are free to intervene. Even other participants, faculty members are also free to intervene.
So in the chat box, we have a question by a student, Adhiraj.
Vikram, you may like to take the question which is there in the chat box. No, it's just an information. It's not a question.
No, it is a question. Very good question, Adhiraj. So there are, let me see, get out of this. Let me just get out of this PowerPoint for a second. And let me find, there are 19 other. So the World Bank is not the only game in town, right? When it was established in the 1940s, the World Bank, in a way, was the only one in its one type of institution that existed. It was not basically one that was found in many other places. But what happened is that gradually, just as the World Bank added entities to its group, the international community created a number of banks around the world in different regions, saying we have one World Bank, but we also need to have banks that are more specialized, that focus on a particular region. So I think the first of these banks was, let me just show you the slide. Current slide. Can you see the slide yet? Can you see the slide? Yeah? Can you see the slide?
Yeah, it's coming.
Okay,
yeah,
so forget about the Adhiraj, forget about the caption, but this is the list of all the other regional banks. Very good question you asked. So I told you the World Bank was established in 1944. It got a clone called IDA, International Development Association, in 1960. By that time, the countries of the world decided that the World Bank was not enough. We needed more sources of development finance because the need was so much that they created in 1959 the Inter-American Bank, focused on development countries of those in the Latin America, Caribbean region. So that was the first regional bank, right? It was organized very much like the World Bank, but with a focus on countries in the region. It did not mean the World Bank could not lend in that region, but it basically got a competitor. So in these countries, the World Bank had to compete with the Inter-American Bank, or countries really had choice, right? If the World Bank could not finance one project, they went to somebody else, which in this case was the Inter-American Bank. Then in 1964, the African Development Bank, because in Africa, they felt that the World Bank could not keep up with demand. They needed a specialized development bank for Africa, so they created a regional development bank in 1964. Then in Asia in 1966, with Japanese support, the Asian Development Bank was created. Okay, again, very much the same idea. Asia was a big continent, lots of development demand. The World Bank could not keep up, so they created. So you see, by 1966, in addition to the World Bank, IBRD and IDA, the two World Bank group entities that are basically in the business of lending to countries for development, there are now 3 region or continent specific banks because the need is so much. But this doesn't stop. In 1967, they say, okay, even the African Development Bank and the World Bank are not enough for some African countries. Let's create the East African Development Bank, focused only on the sub-region, not to exclude these countries in this area of East Africa from the coverage by the African Development Bank or the World Bank, but to add, in a way, a third possibility for development finance. Same thing, the Caribbean region, 1969. Then, of course, the Islamic countries created, especially as oil revenues rose in many countries, the Islamic Development Bank. Then you had the Black Sea Trade and Development Bank. These are sub-regional banks, so countries in the Black Sea. The New Development Bank, which is the China created bank, is actually the BRICS Bank, headed by an Indian actually now, former ICICI chairman, KB Kamath. And then most recently, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is the bank that's created in Beijing. India is also a big shareholder. So you see, these are all of the banks. And now back to the question that it's these are basically the question about whether these banks differ in their objectives. No, for the most part, many of them are institutions that have similar charters and lending requirements and terms. They might differ here and there. For instance, let's say in one country, the Asian, let's say Bangladesh, right? Or let's take a country X, for example. Asian Development Bank may tell the World Bank, so that we are not competing with each other, we will focus on Bangladesh's transport needs. Why don't you focus on housing? That is one possibility, right? So there they are not competing, but they are trying to be complementary. In some cases, there is competition. In some cases, the World Bank may not do something. So for instance, in some areas, we do not believe we have technical skills to do something. The African Development Bank may have said, okay, we have a specialized facility for this kind of thing. So that's the idea. But they all broadly have the same objectives. They all have broadly the similar charters with some variations because lawyers would like to always make some changes. But if you look at the actual governing documents of all of these institutions, they pretty much borrow from the original template in 1944 for IBRD, but have made improvements, I would say, in many cases. Okay. Next question.
Vikram, we don't have the question. But our students would definitely know what a law person like you does at World Bank.
Well, I don't like to talk about myself more than I already do. I think that what I do is what a lawyer does mostly in a law firm, right? You have clients, they call you, they ask you for legal advice. In many cases, we draft agreements. Like on this project I showed you, I drafted the loan agreements. I had to negotiate them. I have to give advice on, on how to interpret our policies. I have to make sure that we have due diligence done. So a lot of what lawyers in a private firm would do, in some cases, we also do things like public international law research. Now, Esperanza and I are involved in working on a country that has a border dispute. It's not India, thankfully. It's not India or Pakistan or China or any other things that you might think it is. It's a country completely far away where both of us are trying to see now what can we do in this area, right? So that's a question that's come to us that has to have the lawyers involved because public international law is at issue. What else have we done, Esperanza? I'm going to try and involve her. She's brilliant, one of the most brilliant. She's only 2 or 3 years out of law school after you, like you guys. So you should be inspired by her, not me, because I constantly learn new things from her, which is why I asked her to join me in this presentation. She's actually working with me, or we are working together, because she is a research. No, what are you called? A Law and Finance Development Fellow. She won a scholarship.
Finance and Development.
She won a scholarship at NYU to come to work for an international financial institution. Very, very competitive, and we gave her a very hard time in the interviews, but she came through with flying colors. But so, what is your experience? Maybe you can share, because you are more closer to them. Because Manvindra tells them not to be like me. I don't know if that was an insult or compliment, but he may not say that to you. So.
Well, I'd say that another part of our work that I really like is the internal seminars that you prepare, not only for lawyers within the vice presidency, but also to economists, so that they know like what they should do or not do regarding a project. There's also a big component of doing research, as you said, like, and we've also been participating in the update of operational policies, or preparing other notes. So I think it's very like diverse. Like, you just do a lot of things, and especially for a recent graduate, it really opens your mind, because you also get to work with people from all over the world, and that's really instructive.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Manvendra, thank you, Esperanza. The NLSIU students will be organizing a talk on careers in international law with a star panel of NLSIU's top alumni in the field. When I say this, I'm not trying to say your school is bad. You're just new, right? You've not yet graduated the first batch yet. Have you graduated? You graduated your first batch? Yeah. So it'll come. So, but because NLSIU is out there for 25 years, right? We are assembling a panel of the top NLSIU graduates who work in international law on the 19th, I think. I've asked NLSIU to open it to all NLUs or anybody else, frankly. But and so I would urge you, all the students, to attend that event, because we're going to have people from the leading experts in each of the field who went through an education like the ones you all are having at a time when actually there were not many resources. And so I would urge you all to come to that. There will be one representative from an international NGO, from an international organization, from an international court, one from an international law firm. So we will have one person from each stream.
That will be wonderful. That will be wonderful.
Yeah. If the DNLU students who work on, if there's a student coordinator, they can be in touch with Rag Yadava. He was a student at NYU, and he's now just appointed assistant professor of international law. Yeah, okay, good. Any other questions? Well, Swati, any questions for me?
Yes, I have two questions. So thank you for such a wonderful presentation today, both of you. It was lovely. I have two questions. One being, if I have to read more about how a state or a province can borrow money, what can I do for that? So where do I read more about it? This is for my personal interest. I'm interested in reading more about it. Apart from this, for the students and for me as well, I want to know that the administrative law principle of transparency, how is it ensured in the World Bank? Or what facets of it can we see in World Bank? You are on mute.
Yeah, sorry. I'm going to have to ask Esperanza to follow up with you on her and my behalf jointly by sending you a paper we may have. There is not that much of literature that, to my knowledge, but this is a subject Esperanza and I will be focusing on in a paper that we are writing together. So I will ask her to follow up with you. I'll talk to you about it later, Esperanza. But I don't think there's enough written up on this subject in India. In fact, if you find anything, please send it to me. I only know the constitutional provisions. But what was your other question? Sorry.
Transparency, about transparency.
Transparency. Yeah, no,
Right.
transparency. Now, transparency means different things in different contexts, right? So, one question is transparency in terms of access to information. When I first came to the World Bank, it was impossible to find any information anywhere, even for people within the bank. But I think in my first year at the World Bank, which is now 20 years ago, I attended an event on the new access to information policy, which totally changed the way the bank protected. It was like India's RTI moment. In fact, there are some people who argue that the World Bank's access to information procedure or policy was patterned on the Indian RTI. I leave the historians to decide whether that's true. But that adoption of that policy basically forced the bank to disclose a lot of its information. It had already been started disclosing, but in a more systematic way. So, for instance, in a project, maybe Esperanza, if you can put a link to that Tamilnadu project, if you can find it, the external link to the documents website, maybe the link I sent you, if you still have it, or if you just Google it and just put it in the chat. If you see the link that Esperanza will share with us shortly, it's a link I sent her to. It's not like, in fact, I didn't give her any documents. I told her, just go to the internet and get these documents. The only document we got was that COVID-19 thing, which is recent project. That'll also be put on the internet if it's not already there. But 99% of the information, as an insider, I can say this very clearly, about a project is already available publicly, even before the project starts, because under the World Bank's policies, it is required to especially disclose environmental and social issues much ahead in time. It's a statutory mandate. And also general issues about how much will this pipe cost, what are they, there's a lot of technical detail about projects already on the website that people just don't know that exists. So the amount of transparency is a lot. Now, the policy I mentioned, which is the access to information policy, also has some restrictions, just as the RTI. So, for instance, my health information, I do not want, obviously, the outside world to know. Or information which I give as an attorney, because I still am a practicing lawyer. I have counsel to my name. So, people who seek my legal counsel on a day-to-day basis, I am obliged, even though I'm not a counsel in a court, I am still a counsel providing legal advice that is privileged. That information is given to a client under the understanding it will be protected pursuant to the attorney-client privilege that exists in many different jurisdictions. So that information, of course, is not transparent. I feel personally, maybe after 30 years, that information too, unless I was giving advice to somebody on some crime, which why I would be advising them, I don't know, because I'm not a criminal lawyer. But I do think after a while, even that information can be disclosed if it's not relating to any ongoing issue. But I think transparency has always been an issue. I'd say it's less of an issue now than it used to be. But when I say that, I don't want to downplay any other concerns NGOs may have that the bank is not fully transparent. I know that our archives, for instance, get a lot of requests every day asking for this report, that report, and they really do their best to track it down. In fact, I have not seen in another organization the extent to which people go to try and get information when it's requested. Now, on the safeguard side, we have the policy. We have a help desk. The website is a lot of material. The e-archives have, the archives of the bank is huge, enormous stuff. But if you're not interested in old stuff, even new stuff, as Esperanza just, if you click that link, you'll go to see how much project information is available. All the stuff we did in today's presentation is available on the external website if you just look for it. Now, if you're dissatisfied with the amount that's been disclosed, you think the World Bank's hiding something, you always you have now a remedy. We have our own internal Rti Commissioner, or actually a group of commissioners. It used to be headed by Wajahat Habibullah, who was, I think, India's first Rti Commissioner. But there is a tribunal, in a sense, at the World Bank. I don't know if you can find that quickly, Esperanza. If you write to information page AI access to information policy at the World Bank, if you don't mind. And you can just put a link. I would do it, but I would my screen might get mucked up. But basically, if Esperanza can find the link, she can share it. Otherwise, she will send it to you separately. No, don't have to scramble for it. But you will see there is in great detail the World Bank's transparency rules. And then, like I said, if you have issues with it, there is an independent tribunal whose decisions are binding on the World Bank. Yes, if host permits another question. Oh, yeah, good, great. See, Esperanza has found that. See, this is why I think she's even better than me. And she can do this in our presentation. Yeah, great. See, access to information. And then you see here, blah, blah. And then somewhere here, there will be links to see requests and appeals. That's an appeal for denial of information. So, yeah, so there's all the stuff that's on the website that Esperanza has shared. Arpit asks, we recently witnessed a trade war between China and the USA and many other international similar. What role do financial institutions play? Well, I mean, to be honest, I don't know. And the reason I say I don't know is you would think that in a trade war, lawyers would be involved. They are usually of the countries. But I have not encountered in my practice, at least, anyone calling me and say, we want to help or assist to mediate the trade war between USA and China. First of all, USA is not a country the World Bank typically gives advice to. Like I said, we have never made a loan to USA. So the idea that the World Bank would get involved in a trade war between the USA and China directly would be interesting, would be difficult to imagine because it's not possible. It is entirely conceivable if there were two developing countries and there was a trade war, the World Bank could be tempted or somebody may ask the World Bank to intervene. That, again, to my knowledge, has not happened. That is not to say it has never happened. But if it were to happen, we have policies in place to ensure that the World Bank does not interfere, because one of the principles in our Articles of Agreement that I mentioned, which were adopted at the Bretton Woods Conference, is that the World Bank is committed to not interfering in the political internal affairs of its member countries. And it cannot be, like most international organizations, in the business of pitting one country against other. It must maintain neutrality. Now, when I say that, I also mentioned in that chart on the 5 World Bank Group institutions, the fifth chart, the fifth column was ICSID, the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. That is by its very mandate required to intervene, not intervene, but to basically manage disputes that are brought to it. But I don't think that a center can itself go out and intervene. But yes, if the US-China trade war results in an investment dispute that falls within the jurisdiction of this institution, ICSID, that institution will get involved. But that is not to say that it will be involved in trying to let's say, mediate the dispute. There might be mediation rules. I don't know. They might have mediation rules, but they won't take a proactive role. They are basically like a court. You come there, you fight your case, right? The court itself will not get involved in settlements. So that's the answer to that question. Anything else, Manvendra?
Just one last question from my side.
Yes, please go ahead.
You negotiate deals, loan agreements. I was curious. You are subjected to which country's jurisdiction? Like, if you are doing it with India, how will that legally manifest in terms of ramifications, if at all?
I'm not sure I fully understood the question. Can you give me an example, if you don't mind?
Yeah, if there are disputes between World Bank and a state and country regarding a loan agreement and its protections. So where that dispute is it only through negotiations or there are some legal enforcement measures? You're on mute, sir.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm just trying to see if I have a slide up that can show you the answer to that. Okay, I found it. Can you see this slide?
Yes.
Yes. So this is an example of a loan that we recently did. Actually, Esperanza found this. So it's an agreement between a country. Okay. So here's the country. This is a legal agreement between a country. Eswatini is the new name for Swaziland. So it's between this country and the World Bank, right? So if you see here, this is the text of the agreement. Agreement blah 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 between International Bank of Reconstruction and the Eswatini Electricity Company now, whereas blah blah blah, right? Then Article 1 says general conditions as defined in the appendix to this loan agreement shall apply to and form part of this agreement. Now, pursuant to that Article 1, if we go to the general conditions, Section 801 of the general conditions, so general conditions are the standard conditions of every World Bank loan, which are read with the loan agreement. So the first part of this, let's say, the first part of this, the first cut, the snippet on top, is the actual legal agreement between the bank and the country, right? Or in this case, the project entity. That refers you to another document, which are the general conditions, which are the standard terms that are basically to be read with, physically attached or not physically attached, but read with, right? We read documents together, right? Read this section with that section. So we're reading section 101 of the legal agreement with section 801 of another document, which is called the general conditions for World Bank financing around the world. So the section 801 of the general conditions of the World Bank says the rights and obligations of the bank and the loan parties under the legal agreements shall be valid and enforceable in accordance with their terms, notwithstanding the law of any country, of any state, or political subdivision thereof to the contrary. Right? So that answers your first part of your question, right? The World Bank considers that the agreements that it enters into with countries are valid and binding despite any other law to the contrary, including the Constitution. We can have a debate about how this is constitutional, but legal position the World Bank takes in all countries is that a World Bank agreement prevails over all domestic law. It has been a position we have taken for the last 60 years. This is a position that all international organizations will take. It's just the way international law is organized. If you sign an international agreement, which constitutes a treaty between an international organization and a member country, that's a sovereign nation, the agreement is an agreement in international law, which, like all other agreements in international law, generally prevail over the national law, unless the national law carves out let's say is to the contrary, in which case the agreement could not have been made in the first place, right? You can question the constitutional competence of the executive to enter into the agreement, but the agreement itself is binding under international law, right? This is, your students will come to it later in international law questions. Then there is also, I don't have it in the screen, but you see the title of this Article 7, right? It says enforceability and arbitration. The arbitration is section 803, which you don't see here. 802 is not relevant to this discussion. The hidden section 803 from the screen is a arbitration provision, which goes to the second part of your question, which is that any disputes between a country or a party to an agreement with the World Bank, right? A country either as a borrower or as an implementer of a World Bank project, or any other entity that's a borrower or an implementer with the guarantee of the country, those disputes are to go to arbitration. So that is the enforcement mechanism. But in the 70 years of the World Bank's history, there has not been, to my case, a single arbitration case. Most of the matters, it doesn't mean there are no disputes. There are disputes on a day-to-day basis. Those disputes are 100% resolved by mutual agreement or negotiations without escalating to arbitration. That goes to your point, and we never go to court for this.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
So I guess with this, we have come to the end of today's program. And on behalf of Dharmashashtra National University, Jabalpur, or DNLU Jabalpur as we call it, I would like to thank our guest speaker, Mr. Vikram Raghavan, for this enlightening discussion that we had about the international financial institutions and what role a law person like him can actually play. And I'm very sure our students have learned something new, that that law student can also contribute in such a global policy initiative like World Bank is also something worth mentioning and worth taking note of. That a law student can, apart from working in law firms and courts, can actually also be doing something so worthwhile, and also in terms of the horizon, that you can actually have a global outlook, that you would be negotiating a loan agreement with Eswatini, a country I just got to know exists, because I was only knowing about Swaziland. So it's an information for me that's now Eswatini. So such is the expanse to which a law student can actually look. And I'm very sure our students have definitely learned quite a few things, and especially this encouragement and inspiration that they must have got is the most important and crucial aspect of today's talk by Mr. Raghavan. So I thank him, and I now that we have this forced option of virtual mode, we hope to catch him a little more, because earlier when he was in Lucknow, he could visit us only when he was in India. Now this gives us this option of having him even when he is not visiting India. So that's one good thing for us. And one thing which I wanted to tell my student is that the books that you see on the back of Vikram is actually, those are his own books. So that also one thing which you should also look for. And he once told me that you don't need to have necessarily read all the books that you own. And that also gave me the encouragement to buy more books, and I follow his advice even today. Not that I don't want to read them, I try to read, but yeah, I obviously buy more books than I could actually read, and that's one inspiration for the same has come from Vikram. I also thank Esperanza and for being there, and not only assisted Vikram but also contributed in her own way in this talk that we had today. And as Vikram also said, our students would also get inspired by somebody like Esperanza. As Vikram said, that she is outstanding, and we would want our students also to be assisting the likes of Vikram at World Bank in future. And for that, Esperanza's presence definitely is a morale booster. And I thank all the students, all the faculty members who have spared their valuable time to be with us for today's event. And we look forward to having Vikram and Esperanza for more such talks on different aspects in future as well. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Manvendra, and I very much enjoyed this lecture, and I look forward to visiting you in Jabalpur. And I want to tell your students they are very lucky that they have someone as passionate, always with a smile, charming, and someone who's truly a great scholar in his own right. Although I have told him he has this bad Indian habit of calling everyone sir. Esperanza and I might be separated in a few years, but if she called me sir, I would have a heart attack. But in India, we have this disease where everybody calls everybody else sir, which they give is that there in Spain also? Do you call people sir if they're a few years older than you?
Not really. Depends.
Okay,
It depends, but it's pretty conservative in Spain to do that.
Okay, yes. India is even more conservative. Anyway, well, nice to meet all of you, and I look forward to meeting more of you.
I followed your advice a bit. I called Vikram many times.
Yes, that's true. I noticed with great reluctance. Okay, good. Talk to you all
Thank you
soon.
so much.
See you soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
See you. Bye.
Bye.